Hi there. I just want to talk about having to pay taxes on interest that you make from savings accounts. Now, traditionally how it works is, let's say you have a savings account and let's say your annual interest rate is 2%. Basically how it works is at the end of the year, you'll have 2% more, which is called interest. That's what the bank then will pay you, 2% more. And then what happens is the government then considers this a capital gain and then charges you tax on that 2% interest that you received. It's basically, it counts almost like income. Now, one problem though that I have with that is the simple fact that governments do not take inflation into consideration. So for example, let's say your interest rate for your savings account is 2% a year, but let's say the inflation rate is 4%. So what happens now is, yes, at the end of the year, you'll have 2% more dollars than you started with because of the interest. But the problem is now is, let's say if the inflation rate is 4%, that means you're going to lose 4% of your buying power. So of course, if you have 2 and minus 4 from 2, you're going to end up with minus 2, which means technically, if you take the inflation into consideration, you're going to lose 2% of your money at the end of the year. And this is exactly my problem, is that the governments do not take inflation into consideration. The governments will simply just say, okay, he started with, let's say, $100. He now has $102 at the end of the year. It's a 2%, due to the 2% interest. And so the government will simply say that those $2, that is considered a gain, and so you then pay tax on the gain. But again, governments don't take the inflation rate into consideration. And so when you take the inflation into consideration, with 2% interest, with let's say a 4% inflation rate, you'll end up with minus 2%. So technically that's considered a loss, but you're still paying tax on it. That's the problem. You're technically paying tax on a loss. Now, in order for you to maintain your buying power, basically what would have to happen is your bank interest rate for your savings account would have to match the inflation rate. So let's say your interest rate, let's say if you're lucky enough to have 4% per year, and let's say the inflation rate is 4%, then at the end of the year, that basically means you're going to maintain your buying power because you're gaining more dollars, but then you're losing 4% of your buying power. But it balances out because you're gaining 4% but losing 4%. You see? So I think technically, in my opinion, governments should only be able to tax you if the interest rate for your bank account is higher than the inflation rate. So let's say inflation is 4. Now I don't know what the current inflation rate is. I mean, it changes all the time, and it's hard to say what the real rate is. I mean, it depends on who you ask. Governments say one thing, and then you have financial institutions have their own opinions on inflation. I mean, so it's hard to say what the real rate is. But again, let's just say technically the inflation rate is 4%, and let's say your savings account, let's say you get 5% interest. That means now technically 1% is going to be a gain, because the other 4% you're getting will just kind of balance out the 4% in the inflation rate. So again, I think that you should only have to pay taxes on your interest if whatever percentage is higher than the inflation rate. So if your interest rate is 5% and the inflation rate is 3%, then you should only have to pay tax on the 1% that's over the inflation rate. So anyway, that's my opinion. I mean, I do a lot of thinking. I'm a kind of person, I think a lot, and that's just how I feel. It's technically a loss. So not only are you losing your buying power from the inflation, the government then is charging you tax on what, in my opinion, is a loss. That's just how I feel, and that's if anyone has their own opinion on that, leave a comment or post your own video. I'd like to hear what people think of that. And before I go, I would just like to apologize for this ugly couch here in the background. I'm fully aware that it's doesn't really go with anything. It's kind of like one of these old couches that you just have and you don't throw away. So again, I apologize about the couch. But anyway, yeah. So So tell me what you think, and have a great day. Thanks.